taking shape over the last 3 years. During our founding conference in 2017, Pope Francis pointed out the need for our contribution in 3 areas that are within our competence: those of research, teaching, and social promotion. He made some useful suggestions to get us to reflect on what we could do in practice. Last year, Pope Francis launched a broad initiative called Global Compact on Education. I believe that our efforts within our network are an important contribution to this new papal initiative. I hope that with the help of Dr. Grandi and others in these and in the forthcoming webinars and initiatives, we may continue to find ways to contribute to the education of refugees while also educating our students and the public in general about the situation of refugees, IDPs, and vulnerable migrants, countering the many myths, fears, and prejudices that poison public debates and stall effective political action on every level. Thank you. Now, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Fernando Reimers, Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education at Harvard University.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm delighted to be participating in this meeting organized by the Gregorian University and by the Refugee Migrant Network. It's my great pleasure to introduce Filippo Grandi, the 11th United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The UN Commission for Refugees, established in 1950 with a staff of 34 people and with a 3-year mandate to basically help resettle refugees in Europe after the war, has grown to be one of the largest organizations in the UN system. Commissioner Grandi was first elected by the UN General Assembly in January of 2016 for a 5-year term, and then he was re-elected to serve until June of 2023. The organization that he leads has twice received the Nobel Prize. It has grown from a staff of 34 people when it was established to having 17,000 people working in more than 130 countries, providing protection and assistance to nearly 80 million refugees, returnees, internally displaced people, and stateless people. Some 90% of the staff of UN High Commission for Refugees work in the field. And the organization operates with an annual budget close to $9 billion. Before being elected as High Commissioner, Mr. Grandi had been engaged in international cooperation for more than 3 decades, focusing on refugee and humanitarian work. He had served as Commissioner General for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and from 2010 to 2014. And he had also served as Deputy Commissioner General since 2005. Before that, he was Deputy Special Representative of the UN Secretary General in Afghanistan, following a long career, first with NGOs and subsequently with the UN High Commission in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. He was born in Milan, and his degrees are from the State University in Milan and from the Gregorian University. It is such a pleasure to welcome you, Commissioner. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reimers. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
And I thank you. And I would like to also thank the rector of the Gregorian University. Indeed, I have by now fairly distant memories of my time there. I have remembered, though I was remembering this was 34 years ago, and I was reminiscing that when I spent some time at the university in parallel, I was volunteering as a young man to work with refugees in Rome, which is my country, by the way, in Rome as a volunteer for Caritas. So many of the things that I'm doing now have distant roots and seeds in that time spent in Rome, and I have remained very grateful for what I have learned and for what has inspired me to do a lot of what I have done later. So thank you very much for having me here. I thought that I would share some very simple remarks on the theme that was chosen, Education in Exile, which is so pertinent and so central to what my organization does, my current organization, UNHCR, but also my previous one, as was just recalled. I led, before UNHCR, the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, which has as its, I would say, one of its core mandates, the education of 500,000 Palestinian children in the Middle East. So education and education in exile has been with me for many, many years as a very central theme. First, maybe some context about this concept of exile. And I'm very grateful to Professor Ramos because he already shared some of the very relevant basic information. There are indeed, at the latest official count, more than 80 million people that are displaced or refugees. This is the largest number we've recorded since we count with a certain precision. I say certain because it's never precise, but it gives a sense of the volume. And as you know, we maintain, we remain faithful to a definition of who's a refugee and a displaced person. So people fleeing from violence, from discrimination, from war, and from persecution. Naturally, we live in a world in which human mobility is extremely high and in which people moving for other compelling needs, like poverty, for example, move alongside refugees and displaced in flows that are more and more complex. This is why we certainly continue to focus on refugees according to the traditional definitions, also because if we put them on the table for discussion, we'll simply lose ground in this very politicized world. But we have to accept that work on the ground is broader than that, very complex, requires partnership, requires the involvement of many. Back to these 80 million people are either displaced inside their country, mostly very fragile countries in conflict, or refugees, and most of the refugees, 80 to 90%, are in the countries next to the countries they come from, contrary to the perception that we so often hear that this is a crisis of the rich world. It is not. It is a crisis of poor countries receiving destitute people from poor countries very often, or from very fragile countries. So it's a more dramatic crisis in a way, and certainly it is not that is one that is impacting primarily countries with a large number of resources. I think that many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with who a refugee or a displaced person is. A person, I often say, having worked for so many years with these people, that they are among the people who make some of the most difficult choices anybody can make in this world, which is the choice to leave behind everything that you cherish, everything that you know, everything that you are familiar with. So this plunging into the unknown is really the gist of the experience of exile. And it often comes not only with material deprivation, but with a huge baggage of fear and anxiety and often depression and sense of frustration and isolation. very, very often this population lives on very precarious means. Humanitarian assistance reaches some of them, but is very inadequate to meet all the needs. People on the move depend very much on daily wages, on fragile employment, on livelihoods that are very easy to disappear. And of course, this has been heightened. This has increased exponentially in the last year, because the lockdowns in most of the countries in the world linked to the COVID-19 responses have meant for millions of people, including those on the move, forced to be on the move, the loss of livelihoods. The livelihoods that these people depend on are among the first to disappear in lockdowns, because they're linked to a type of economy that cannot survive the type of situations we have all been living in rich and poor countries in the last few months. And COVID-19 has also, of course, impacted these people in other ways. Surely, I have to say, in most countries, the health responses have included refugees or displaced people. I think all states understood very quickly that excluding anybody on their territory from these health responses would have meant increasing risk of contagion. But it has affected this population other than on the economic side in many other ways. One is, of course, the difficulty of crossing borders. Many borders have been closed because of the pandemic. You know, I often say that when you deal with displaced people, with uprooted people, movement, including crossing borders, movement is vital for people to seek safety. We live since a year ago in a world in which movement has become a liability for people's lives because it brings the virus. So people on the move are in this terrible situation in which their running across border may be the only way to save their lives. We've seen it, for example, from Congo to Uganda. I've seen it recently in Sudan with people coming from Ethiopia. But that movement is perceived and is perhaps also a risk to other people's lives. So balancing these different situations has been a great challenge. But another challenge, and coming to more our topic has been, of course, the risk to education and to other social services. Let me come to that, though. Now, I shared a few thoughts about exile and the crisis that exile represents for people and societies. Of course, within that crisis, people, and especially people on the move, always seek opportunities as well. This is the nature of humanity, to seek opportunity even in adversity. It is very interesting, and I have lived this, as I'm sure many of you have, since the very beginning of my work with people on the move. The first thing that when you ask refugees, what's the main challenge? The first thing is always security. What is your main need? It's always security. And then, of course, the very basic issues, food, be able to live. But immediately after that, and often at the same time as that, comes the request for education for the children. This is very powerful. And I'm not just making it up because we're talking about this topic. I'm saying it because I have experienced over and over again. For me, the Palestinian refugee experience was very telling. The attachment of the Palestinians to education, the Palestinian people that have lost everything in history and in their lives, what they have is education. And they cling to it desperately because they know that if they have a little light at the end of their tunnel, this is in the education of their children. I remember in one of my visits to Syria, talking to people that had returned from the experience of exile, telling me that and showing me, in their house to which they had gone back, showing me that when they had fled, they had taken very few things with them, but one thing that they had taken was study certificates, because they knew that with those study certificates, they could perhaps have access to school in exile. These are just a few examples. I can give you so many other examples of the importance of education for people on the move, because I think that refugees and displaced people know very well that education is not only a fundamental human rights, is not only one of the key objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals, but more practically for them, it is a tool to create opportunities in adversity and try to achieve the potential that they know they're carrying with them. But, and this is one of the most frustrating experiences of exile, very often is going to dry up in a situation in which those opportunities are so scarce. A few simple data on refugee education. They're not good data, I have to warn you, because if you compare the enrollment statistics for the general population with those of the refugee population in particular, they don't compare favorably. The refugee children, in 77%, we estimate, attend primary school. You may think it's not too bad, but if you compare with the general population worldwide, that percentage exceeds all over the world 90%. So we're quite far from the overall enrollment. But this gets much worse when you go to secondary school enrollment. There the percentage goes back to 31%, and it goes to a pithy 3% if you look at tertiary university education. Now, we've made a lot of progress in the past few years. There was one experience that was particularly significant, the Syrian refugee experience. When Syrians, among others, but mostly Syrians, streamed towards Europe, you remember, in 2015 and 16, in that big flow that ended up largely in Germany, Sweden, Austria, and other countries. Many of those people were refugees, if you remember. I took office during that particular crisis. One of the reasons why these people were on the move was that in exile in countries neighboring Syria, 5-6 million people in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and other countries, access to education because of lack of resources had dwindled to almost nothing. It was not the only reason why they moved on, but that was one of the powerful reasons they gave for this movement. And that was an eye-opener. Let's be frank. I said at the beginning, this is not a rich country's crisis, but when the crisis reaches rich countries, it triggers some measures, it triggers some reflection and some action in addressing some of the problems that cause this plight. And there was quite a lot of thinking around how can we improve the education of displaced people. And there was, much reflection, resources invested, big players like the World Bank, international financial institutions suddenly becoming involved in this response. And the data that were very bad then, we were talking about 50% of the global refugee population attending primary school, the children, and now we're 77. That progress, relatively fast in 5 years, was a result of what was done after the Syria crisis. Now, I am worried that COVID is setting that progress back. We have conducted, you might know that, but for example, with the Malala Foundation, we've conducted some survey and studies of refugee education. And we fear, for example, that as lockdowns end and schools reopen, because in many countries schools have been closed, and children go back to school, the last ones who will go back to schools are among the refugees and displaced, particularly refugee and displaced girls. And this is directly linked to what I said earlier, that the poverty crisis that has followed the lockdown and that has affected this population means, for example, and I've seen it in Lebanon just very recently, many families say we cannot send our kids back to school because they have to work. And we cannot send girls back to school because for many, and it is tragic, the only solution is to marry them off at a very early age as a survival mechanism. So these are really very serious setbacks that we're seeing in many parts of the world and that we need to address. And if you zoom to tertiary education in refugee settings often means scholarships, means moving. That also has been affected greatly by COVID because of the restrictions in movement. So at all levels, across the span of education, the pandemic puts gains made in the last few years at risk in the field of refugee education. Now, an important thing that I want to stress, what we did in the years following 2015 and 16, we invested a great deal, not so much, especially for primary and secondary education, not so much in creating parallel system of education for refugees, but in ensuring that wherever refugees are present, especially in large numbers, they can have access to existing national education system. And in some countries, Jordan, for example, but many African countries as well, Uganda and other, we've made great strides. That is less costly, and that is more conducive, if not to local integration, which often is difficult, at least to inclusion and coexistence and social cohesion between local communities and refugees themselves. However, this can only happen in a positive and constructive way if resources are invested to help those countries step up, beef up their education system so that they can absorb large population. Remember, we're not talking about 10,000 people here and there. We're talking about countries that sometimes have to absorb hundreds of thousands of children in their primary and secondary education systems. So that's why we have worked with the World Bank. We have worked with other institutions to create even specific financial tools, concessional loans or grants for countries hosting large numbers of refugees. And through the mobilization of that type of resources that is very different from humanitarian money, we have been able to convince states to go for inclusion. It hasn't happened everywhere. Bangladesh, for example, continues not to include Rohingya refugee children for a variety of reasons, and this is difficult also in other countries, but the discussion is open and very important, especially now with COVID. And to conclude, some words on the way forward. The challenges are very big, as you heard. We have, however, tried to set some rather ambitious targets that we would like to share with you and seek support for. One is to obtain within 10 years, it's very ambitious, but we're looking at 2030, which is the Sustainable Development Goal timeframe. Can we try to achieve parity in enrollment in primary and secondary school between national populations and refugee or displaced populations? And tertiary education, because that's more difficult, can we move from the current 3% of refugees enrolled in university, post-secondary education, etc.? Can we reach 15% by 2030? We call it 15 by 30, 15% by 2030. This is what we're working on in different ways. Of course, we have some useful tools. You probably know that in 2018, the United Nations endorsed a global compact on refugees, which includes, makes available, if you wish, offers to states some important tools in terms of inclusion in particular, including inclusion in education systems. The Global Compact also, for the first time, puts forward a model of response to displacement crisis, which is not purely humanitarian, but spans across the spectrum, goes into more sustainable approaches in financial, economic terms, but also encompasses a much wider range of actors, not anymore the traditional, international UN, NGO, government approach, but an approach that foresees the involvement of civil society, of the business community, of academia as well. And I realize that I'm speaking here about many representatives of that important sector. We've already launched, together with a number of academic institutions, a network that is reflecting on how academia can help in the pursuit of the goals of the Global Compact on refugees. A year after the compact, in December 19, just before the pandemic, we were lucky to just manage it before the pandemic, we convened the first ever Global Refugee Forum here in Geneva, where between states, organizations, civil society, private companies, universities, 1,400 pledges were made to fulfill the ambitions of the Global Compact, many of which, in spite of the difficulties of the pandemic, are on their way to being met, and 200 of which were devoted exclusively to education of refugees. But we need much more. And my final point would be to just list very quickly and almost, not in any particular order, some of the areas where I think my organization, the humanitarian community, and academia could work together to pursue these goals. One is to advocate, to use your power of advocacy to advocate for inclusive policies. I've spoken about the importance and power of inclusion. It's very important to advocate, especially in countries where refugee children are not included in education structures. We need support. We need support in providing, for example, language courses and preparatory courses that often we have to provide in order for children to be included in foreign education systems. We need, very simply, support to improve infrastructure in schools. We need support to support, in turn, teacher training, or to foster community-based activities parallel to education. I mentioned the example of Lebanon, to ensure that children can stay in schools when hardship hits their families. We need support in making online courses available. With the pandemic, this has become, of course, a very big necessity for all. Remember, for many refugees, it is not new. It is a necessity that they had even before, because they live, especially children, in very remote places. We need support in creating more scholarships. We have a very valuable cooperation with the German government around DAFI scholarships for secondary and post-secondary education for refugees in the countries where they're hosted. So these are not distant travel scholarships, but they're close to where they live. But we need that model to be replicated elsewhere. This is our 70th anniversary as an organization. 1950, 1951 is the Refugee Convention. We've launched a 70 by 70 scholarships for 70 years. We've already exceeded this funding for 70 scholarships, but we want to push it further and to have an anniversary scholarship program that begins this year. And of course, I think I heard the rector mention this in his introduction. Research is very, very valuable. And we know the power of research that you have. Research, we can only improve in investing in refugee education if all of this is obviously data-based and evidence-based, and research will be invaluable for that. I've spoken for far too long, Professor Reimers. I hope I haven't exceeded my slot. I wanted to share very practical thoughts with all of you, and I'll be very happy to take questions and to debate further. Thank you very, very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Grandi, for sharing these ideas and for setting the stage for our conversation. I wanted to ask you just a couple of questions before I invite my colleagues to do the same. And the first one is to ask you to look back to then look forward. If we look back 7 decades ago, the creation of your agency, as was the creation of the United Nations in general, was a remarkable visionary exercise, was a recognition in the wake of the violence caused by World War II, and the recognition of the shared responsibility, of the complicity of a world that had really stood silent, allowing the genocide to take place, that violence to take place, to step up and say, never again, let's build a world that is more inclusive. But of course, and I think that the UN in general has done a tremendous amount of good to build that world that is more peaceful and sustainable. In some areas of the world of the UN, we have seen a lot of invention, a lot of aggiornamento of the ideas. For example, climate change, an issue that was not on the agenda 7 decades ago. It's one of the issues where the UN is shining. Gender equality, even education. You look at target 4.7, it's a far cry from the way we used to define what the problems were 7 decades ago. My question for you is, when it comes to refugee, have we seen similar aggiornamento? Have we seen similar keeping up with the problems? For example, is the fact that the definition of who is a refugee, which, as you know, is a very restrictive definition that encompasses a very small fraction of the number of displaced people, is that useful or is that a hindrance to you? If it were up to you, if you could redefine it, if we were again in a 1950 moment, do we need to change the definition? Because as you know, if the concern is with the right to education, there are many more internally displaced children in China, in India, whose right to education is negated because the displacement deprives them of the legal rights to an education than the number of people who fit in the definition of a refugee. So my question to you is, when you look at your agency relative to other agencies in the UN, is the vocabulary, is the way in which you define your target kept up with the times, or is there more that you would like to see change?
This is a very complex question that has many parts. I'll try to be very quick. First of all, the definition, the 1951 definition, is no doubt, was born out of a necessity, which was to provide support, protection and support, mostly, let's be very factual, to people back then fleeing across the Iron Curtain and coming to the West. So individuals that mostly fled for, because they were persecuted because of their opinions. So that's how UNHCR was born. You said it yourself, 34 people. It was an organization of human rights lawyers, basically, that developed the initial thinking around the organization. But I have to say, and I am always surprised how this is not better known, how the organization itself has adapted enormously. I mean, we're now 17,000 people working in 120 plus countries with a budget of $9 billion. Why? Because over the years, we had to face expanded situation of displacement. First, it was, just to give an example, the Hungarian Revolution, 1956, 400,000 refugees. That was an escalation of the same movement across the Iron Curtain. Then there was decolonization and conflicts in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And that transformed UNHCR also in a humanitarian organization, which it wasn't in the beginning, providing assistance, creating refugee camps, distributing relief items. And then that also triggered the creation, and this is also very important, of additional legal instruments. The Convention of the Organization of African Unity, 1969, the Cartagena Declaration, which we are using now for the Venezuelans, 1984. These are instruments that we use and we leverage with governments to obtain protection that are much broader than the Refugee Convention and recognize factors of flight that were unthinkable in 1951 because simply they didn't exist or they were not on the radar screen. So there is a capacity to adapt that is considerable. We are deeply involved in a debate with other organizations and state on the protection aspects of displacement generated by climate change. For example, we can transfer some of the categories that we use for the traditional refugee movements to people that are moving not because of war or of persecution, but because of natural disasters or slower onset type of effects of climate change, etc., etc. So it's quite broad and adaptable because the 1951 convention is amazingly adaptable and still usable. We have to be very careful, very careful. I'll be very transparent, not to open a discussion on definitions, because that discussion is destined in the present political environment to erode and not to expand, to diminish the sense of responsibility of states for people on the move, because this is unfortunately the context of today's world. So we keep that definition that applies, yes, to a more limited number of people. Still 80 million is not bad. We certainly applied easily to internally displaced people, not maybe the legal categories, but all that goes with it in terms of protection. We're very involved in IDP situations across the world, so it hasn't stopped us from doing that, and we've strengthened it recently. And therefore, this is what happens. Now, of course, if you take the education needs of all the vulnerable children of the world, can UNHCR advocate for all of them? No, that would weaken our mandate. There's other organizations that can do that for children that are equally in vulnerable situation and maybe in some kind of displacement. I'm not so sure about that, migration related and so forth. So we're trying to partner with them. You know, on this issue of education, for example, very recently, we partnered with UNICEF precisely to avoid this limitation. So we focus on those people for whom we have mandate and expertise, and UNICEF focuses on all the other children that live very often in the same countries, in the same areas, but we try to promote education for all. So what we cannot do, either because it is difficult institutionally or because resources don't allow, we try to achieve through partnerships. So I think we need to be careful in saying that definitions limit us, because I think they don't. And where we use them because they represent obligations for states that we want to hold them accountable to.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Let me ask you a second question. I was so pleased to see a picture of yourself with President Ivan Duque last week in Colombia at an announcement that the Colombian government made, giving legal status for the next 10 years to the over 1 million displaced persons from Venezuela who live in Colombia. And the reason I was pleased to see that is because it seems to me the situation of displaced Venezuelans, 5 million by your own numbers, is an interesting paradoxical one. Most of those people have benefited from great generosity and solidarity of neighboring countries. But it seems to me it's a relatively invisible or less visible situation within the US system than other refugees. To give you an example, UNESCO published last year a 500-page report on education for displaced people and refugees around the world, which devoted 2 paragraphs to the Venezuelan refugees. So at least within that report, they're not very visible. So my question to you is, What role did the UN High Commission play in this unprecedented and exemplary decision policy of the Colombian government? And what can we learn from that example about the role of national governments in addressing the needs of refugees? And what can we learn from that example about the role and the opportunities of international development agencies?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. First of all, because I've just come back from Colombia, and indeed that was I think in my now more than 5 years in this job, this has been one of the highlights. That moment in which President Duque declared, what he declared technically was a temporary protection status for all Venezuelans living in Colombia. There's 1.8 million at the moment. And this number is probably conservative and destined to grow for the next 2 years. I think more people will be included. So we will have more than 2 million Venezuelans subjected to this regularization, if you wish. It's practically very important. You know, this means that people will be inscribed in a register, will be identified, will have identity, will be able to access education, will be able to access employment, if it is available, will be able to access health services, vaccinations when they become available for COVID, just a few examples. So really amazing, this gesture. Of course, it is also a necessity for a state like Colombia to identify people, to ensure that they don't represent an element of insecurity, of instability, especially in some parts of the country. So it's a win-win for all, I would say. This is the first important question. The second part of the question is very important as well. Now, Colombia, just like the other dozen countries that have received this almost 5 million, some others are also beyond the region. There's almost 6 million now that have left the country. Colombia is a middle-income country, and so are most of those countries: Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, some of the Caribbean countries, and so forth. It's more difficult to mobilize aid for middle-income countries because of the way aid is designed. So we have been able from the beginning to mobilize humanitarian assistance, but humanitarian assistance in situations such as this one with such a huge mass is very, I wouldn't say insignificant, is very useful, but is not sufficient. So we have tried to mobilize, for example, I said it earlier, international financial institutions. You know, for the first time last year in May, with strong leadership by the European Union and Spain, we mobilized more than $2.5 billion in grants and very concessional loans by the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank for a number of those countries. So this was the first time that we did get a response to this crisis. We did get a sense that the international community was aware that we could not leave these countries alone. And I think what President Duque did the other day has many aspects as a message. It says, we're generous, we do it, we need it, but we do it, but we cannot do it alone. And this was his message, which I strongly supported. Now, a final point that I would like to say, back to your definition question, the Venezuelan outflow challenged a bit that, because how do you define these people? There's no war in Venezuela. There's a political crisis, and most likely, not most likely, most surely, a crisis of governance, a collapse of services, a collapse of the economy. How do you define people that come out? You know, we decided very early on with the Secretary General, who, as you know, my Secretary General is an expert. He's my predecessor in this job. And we decided that there was no point in arguing on definitions too much. This was a population on the move that needed protection and needed support. So the Secretary General asked the organization, the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and UNHCR, the refugee organization, to tandem, to pull together, to create a platform and to respond to the crisis together. irrespective of the categorization of these people. And the platform has now more than 200 organizations. Maybe some of you are represented there. Regionally, in Colombia alone, we have 70 organizations working on it. And this is quite an extraordinary partnership. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It took us a long time to highlight that this was probably, with Syria, the biggest displacement crisis in the world. But I think that we've made progress, and the decision by the president will help us a lot in that respect. Now we need to mobilize and really help these people until they can go back to their country.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I'm going to turn it over to some of my colleagues now who have some questions for you. First question is from Brenda Apeta, who's the Director of Teaching and Learning of Pangea Educational Development. Brenda.
Thank you so much. Hello, my name is Brenda. I serve as the Director of Teaching and Learning with Pangea Educational Development, an organization based in Uganda. We've been working to improve quality of education for refugee learners. We've been particularly focused on providing culturally relevant learning materials for refugee learners so that they can see themselves and their own culture in the learning materials to not only help improve literacy outcomes, but also to maintain their own culture in displacement. We have seen a shift towards integrating refugee learners into host country education systems. How then can we balance meeting the host country's curriculum while adapting the materials, our materials, to still be culturally relevant to refugee learners? Thank you.
Over to you, Commissioner.
Professor Reimers, do you want me to respond question by question or take them all at the end?
Yes, I think that'll make it more fluid.
Question by question. Yeah, and here it's fairly straightforward. First of all, Brenda, hi. You know, I hope everybody knows that Uganda is one of the most generous countries in the world when it comes to hosting refugees. 1.5 million South Sudanese, Congolese, Burundians, Somalis, and you name it. And this is a country that has always had a policy of inclusion in the economy and in services. And I want to say this, Brenda, allow me. You know, when there was fighting in Eastern Congo in the summer of last year, and 10,000 Congolese pushing at the Ugandan border, the Ugandans telling us we are in the middle of a peak of pandemic. They were at that point. How can we do? So we work together to create isolation wards, to create, to provide testing facilities. And the Ugandans say, fine, with a little help, we'll open the door, let them in. That was an example I have used in the whole world when rich countries were closing borders to people trying to cross. Uganda, which doesn't have many resources, open its doors. Sorry, I wanted to flag that because it's very close to my heart. I'm going to visit next month, hopefully, and I hope to see more. But of course, you touch on a very important subject. How do we do that? I think, Brenda, that we have to make a judgment almost case by case. There are situations in which most likely integration or even inclusion for a number of years might be difficult. And therefore, you know, the most likely option for people is to eventually go back to their countries. Then you have to invest more in their culture, their language, their curriculum, right? Because that's what they will need when they go back. If the prospects for integration are better, and especially if unfortunately, sometimes the prospect for a long stay in the country of asylum are there, and especially in situations where there is affinity between the culture of the two countries, sometimes the language, then in my opinion, it is better to use the national curriculum because it is more conducive to peaceful coexistence with host communities. What we can do, and I mentioned it briefly in my final points, very practical points, is to develop in those situations special courses for refugees in their language, for example, or in matters related to their country. This is what we do in many places in order for them to to maintain that link with their home country. It's a difficult call. And, in many countries, children are not even allowed to keep studying their original language. There's also the opposite, extreme opposite. In Bangladesh, I gave that example. In the big refugee camps of Cox's Bazar, almost 1 million Rohingya there, they don't want inclusion in national schools. So we have negotiated that at least in the camps they can study the Burmese curriculum, hoping that one day they will go back. I'm not even so sure this will happen, but this is still the objective. So we have obtained that permission, and we have actually hired Burmese teachers to try and teach them their original the language of their country. It's a very ad hoc situation that you need to really judge on a case-by-case basis. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's hear from Professor Michelle Piston from the Villanova School of Law.
Hi, I just recently started teaching, and I'm a university professor, and I recently started teaching a course online. And I love your idea of UNHCR's mission of moving from 3% to 15% in terms of tertiary education. That's my specialty. And I certainly think it's doable. I think it's doable, especially if we think about using online technologies. The course that I developed recently for immigrant advocates has been really successful using online technologies. So I'd love to hear what you think might be the obstacles to using online technologies to reach that goal of getting 15% of the population educated with tertiary education by 2030.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, you're the expert, so you know more than me. But I think I would say a first obvious, not obstacle, but something that we need to address is resources, clearly, is resources. And the second one is, but you tell me because you know better, is admissions, because even distance learning requires admission to a university or to a course so that you can do that. This is sometimes very difficult for refugees. And remember, people on the move, refugees, displaced, often we have a very big problem with certificates. They cannot prove their education. So these are all different types of obstacles that we're trying to surmount. But there are great opportunities as well. I'll give you one example. And this applies not only, actually, it applies to more to primary and secondary education, but it could apply also to tertiary. We have already had for a number of years now, in the context of the compact, an agreement, a partnership with Vodafone, the telephone company. They have started a program with us of connected schools in Africa. So in very remote places where there are refugees, but also for nationals, and schools are not connected to the internet, they help us with that connection. It's very simple. But through that connection, it's amazing what schools in deprived area can achieve in terms of distant learning, distant teaching, and so forth. So this is an example from another area, not tertiary education, but this is to say that the private sector can help us a lot with technology and resources. There's a lot of interest in the private sector that we're trying to tap into to overcome that particular obstacle. On the certificate side, which is a bit obstacle, we work with UNESCO. For example, in Europe, we have something called, I can't remember the exact name. It's a kind of passport that we give to refugees. Refugees have to go through a certain dialogue with us. We ask questions, we do research, we help them, and then we certify that they have gone through certain studies, even if they don't have those qualifications on a piece of paper. They still have to undergo some procedures in the countries where they are, but this passport is a kind of guarantee that their case is worthwhile, is serious, is credible. And through this, many hundreds of, for example, of young refugees that had done some training or some studies in the medical area could be employed by hospitals during COVID. It's amazing. You'll be surprised in the UK, in Italy, and in other countries. So there are many ways to overcome these obstacles, need to be creative. We are very open, if you're interested, I guess you're in the US, contact, as they would say, contact your closest UNHCR office and reach out, because I think there will be a lot of interest in having dialogue on these issues, initiatives, even if it is, giving access to 1 refugee, 2 refugees in a school. It's fantastic. It gets us closer to 15%.
Right.
Thank you, Commissioner. We're going to hear now from Father David Holcroft, who is with the professional and post-secondary education services of the Jesuit Refugee Service. And the Jesuit Refugee Service, for those listening, is especially interesting, at least to me, for at least 2 reasons. Number one, because in terms of definition, they're very different to the UN High Commission, in that they actually adopt the definition of a de facto refugee to all people prosecuted by race, religion, membership, victims of armed conflicts, economic policies, natural disasters, and humanitarian reasons, including internally displaced people. Now, they were created more recently than the UN High Commission, 1980, but of course they are part of what is arguably the oldest educational organization in the world, the Society of Jesus, established in 1540. I think that a comparative case study of the Refugee Service and the UN High Commission, because they have such different definitions, would actually make for a wonderful doctoral dissertation. Maybe it would help us move the field. But over to you, Father Holcroft. You are on mute. I think you need to unmute your mic.
That's very true. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Filippo, for your presentation. And and just as I begin, the bells outside my window are ringing here in Rome. Thank you for your stimulating presentation. And I really loved what you really picked up on the question I was going to ask you, which was about the way that humanitarian agencies such as ourselves need to move in this time of the refugee compacts, of the Global Refugee Forum, and of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. My work is in trying to take people who may or may not have got through secondary school, give them training, and then transition them into work. And I'd just like to get your thoughts on how you see the role of a humanitarian agency like ourselves in helping this process of getting refugees through into gainful employment and sort of growing the economies of refugee areas such as camps, but also the urban areas, often very poor, where refugees settle. And I'd be just interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Father David. Yeah, let me be a bit personal here. I am very indebted to the Society of Jesus. I've studied 5 years of my life in high school with Jesuits. And I have to also make another disclosure. I have actually worked for the Jesuit Refugee Services at the start of my career. This is an organization that is very, very close to my heart and that does fantastic work and in partnership with us in many parts of the world. Father, your question is difficult. Not difficult as a question, it's difficult as a subject, because I think that much as we have a kind of blueprint with the compact in areas like education and health through this inclusive model, right? Inclusion in services, as opposed, when I was young, we worked mostly in refugee camps, so in enclosed places, creating services for refugees in those places. Nowadays, the vast majority of refugees are not in refugee camps. They are in communities, most often than not in poor communities. So for services, inclusion is a good model if the services are strengthened. by the international community, but the job creation remains the most challenging, and in a way more challenging for people that are living in the community itself, when the community suffers from unemployment and other types of hardship. So I don't have an all-encompassing answer here. In our discussions with the, these things cannot be addressed by the humanitarian agencies other than at a very micro level for the most vulnerable cases, or creating, a minimum number of jobs. This can only be employed through economic policies of the countries where people are hosted. So we are working on a number of issues. I'll give you a few examples. We're working, for example, towards financial inclusion, meaning making sure that refugees, displaced people, wherever they are, can open bank accounts. This seems a very simple matter, but it is actually vital in order for people to start even small businesses. So this is one direction in which we're working. We're working with some institutions, for example, the International Financial Corporation. This is part of the World Bank Group. This is their private sector arm. We've piloted some very interesting projects in Kenya, for example, trying to create, in settings where refugees are present, opportunities for investment, which would result then in employment for both the host community and the refugees. Again, this is not macro, but it is not micro either. This is somewhere in the middle already. In Kenya, at the South Sudan border, we've scored some good successes, thanks in particular to the good cooperation of the local authorities. And we have generated some investment, interestingly, not from international companies, but by Kenyan companies that saw the opportunity there, for example, to work with relatively cheap labor to produce food, small food industry. But this generated employment for a number of refugees. So I'm giving you a few examples to show how we can work in some directions, but let's be honest, this is immensely more difficult than education and health. And there's another area where we need to make progress: the possibility for refugees to have actually access to the labor market. In many situations, it is not really work that is lacking, especially for people that, frankly, may be ready to do some pretty tough work and work hard, because people that are displaced work hard. They work harder because they need it, because they want to prove themselves. And the problem is that there are barriers, legal barriers to access work. In some countries, we've made progress. In Turkey, for example, Syrians in the beginning of the exodus could not work at all, not legally anyway. So they could work illegally, which is a risk. But we obtained the possibility for them to have access to work, not everywhere, not for all jobs, but there was an expansion of that span of jobs that they could access. So this is another area. So financial inclusion, investments, work permits, these are all areas unpacking this complex issue where we could work. Just a final note, back to Professor Reimer's introduction. I'm not so sure. I want to repeat it again. Let's not be so hung up on the issue of definitions. Of course, JRS is an NGO and can choose the population they serve is their choice. I represent a United Nations agency that has some bigger constraint in that area. But frankly, all the categories you mentioned, we are serving already. So we have adapted a lot from the initial definitions. I hope that this adaptation is known also in the academic world.
Thank you. Let's hear now from Professor Anne-Sophie Crossa from the Catholic University of Applied Sciences in Mainz.
Yes, hello, and many thanks for the opportunity to ask a question today. Thanks especially to you, Tony. Yeah, I'm a professor at the Catholic University in Mainz. The Catholic University is a founding member of the RME network. So we are participating since a while already. I'm a sociologist, and I'm especially interested in conflict theory, globalization theory, and generally in processes of societal integration. And of course, I'm also locally bounded in a way to this perspective of an incoming or receiving state. And so I'm going to talk from a slightly different perspective in a way. And I would like to ask you to allow me to go a little bit deeper in this discussion, because I'm not sure if this is real English, but in my heart, I have in my chest, I have two hearts at the moment. Yeah, this is a literal translation from German. And the one heart is really happy hearing about all these initiatives of education and this way of giving sense and hope and direction to people's lives in very difficult situations. The other heart, in a way, is more skeptical, because what I'm wondering is, especially when we talk about education, this is a kind of formal term, and what we are thinking of is, I think, not of education for the sake of it, but education as a means of integration, as a means of finding feet in a different place. And I'm a bit skeptical, because what we also do inadvertently, I'm sure, is supporting a particular system or power structures, we could say. I'm worried that we are imposing particular ways of thinking education, of being educated, of contents of education on people, with a kind of distant promise: if you learn what we tell you and the way we tell you, you will have a chance to be integrated. And my experience is that, well, some do follow these ideas. Some have certain successes with this, but this is very much dependent on an overall structure and situation. You were mentioning COVID-19, and what I did recently was a research on volunteers and refugees. So what are the relations between them? And I focused, that was something that came from the field, very interestingly, on mutual ascriptions of dirt and cleanliness. There's a long tradition in anthropological studies of this, and it goes much deeper. It's all about social order. But now with COVID-19 and this old idea of the risk of contamination, it all comes together again. So what I want to say is that education, especially if it's very formal or functionally thought in a way, could be a promise that we are not able to keep. And I wonder what kind of things people need to learn in order to deal with this. And I'm wondering, you have seen a lot of projects, a lot of initiatives, and where do we have something that goes beyond this level and strengthens people in a different way, so that they are able to switch from this being on the move, enduring, waiting, and then arriving somewhere and expecting things to change and being part of it. It's about recognition in the end. So I wonder, what kind of patterns do you see of examples that could give this kind of different perspective to our subject? Thank you.
I hope I understood the question correctly. It's a very complicated question. I don't know, I'm not an education expert, unlike you, Professor Crossa, so I'm not so sure I can reply with competence. I can only say that basic education, first of all, let me put it straight here. You are talking very much from the perspective of where you live, where the challenge for refugees is integration, right? Is integration. In most countries, unfortunately, this is not even a possibility. Refugees are hosted temporarily all over the world, not in Europe, all over the world. And most likely they will have to either go back to their country or find other solutions. It's a much more precarious situation that we're talking about. I think it's important to put that in. That actually makes your question even more complex from that point of view. I think that basic education, primary education, is a right for everybody, wherever you are, in whichever situation you are. And I think, I don't know if I understand correctly your question, but I don't see how that can be ignored or not given, or given differently. There are some foundations that every human being needs to know, read and write, understand, judge, think, and that is what should be given to all people on the move, wherever they are, because they also have a future. That future may be integration if it is in Germany, but maybe return to their country if it is in most countries in Africa, etc., etc. Then there are more, higher levels of education, and this is where it becomes perhaps more relevant, at least the way I understand it. Many refugees, I know from my years with the Palestinians, would like to have very formal education, modeled often on the Western model of education. And I agree, if that's the sense of your question, that may not be conducive to a productive future in the situations they're in the precarious situations they're in. But then the issue is not to give them education if they want, but to adapt that education to that particular context. I haven't mentioned, and your question reminded me, I haven't mentioned the importance of what used to be called, maybe this more modern name, vocational training, teaching people professions, even very practical professions. And I think that, your government, the German government, is very good at that because supports vocational training programs for displaced populations in many countries. And I think that this is very important because that has the dignity of education, provides intellectual capacity to people, but at the same time provides a type of knowledge that is more easily used to gain access to employment in many of those countries. There is a perception often, even in displaced communities, that this is less dignified or less prestigious than the more formal types of education. I think it's important to dispel that perception, and this is what we're trying to do, because that type of training and formation is often more easy to provide and can give access to jobs. I don't know if this provides, gives an answer to your highly complex question, but these are some elements that I would like to contribute.
Okay, let's turn over now to the questions. We invited those of you who sign up for the seminar to submit questions in advance. And there was a large number of questions. So we have grouped them in 4 blocks. And I'm just going to name the blocks and turn it over to you, Commissioner. Do the best you can. I think we have 10 minutes left. So the first question is, how do we make sure that the organizations that work with refugees are effective, that the services they delivered are really based on the best evidence about what works, that is cost effective, and also that they're held accountable. This question of accountability is especially important in a world in which the way in which there was an embracement of the idea that we were all in this together in this world, and that international organizations really help us deliver on this shared vision of a world for all. That idea has become a lot more contested, sadly, these days than it used to be. So the question of accountability is front and center. The second block of questions is, how do we make sure that the education that refugees receive is actually relevant and of sufficient quality so that it makes a difference to their lives once they get out of school? And that goes to the point that you already addressed earlier, which is that oftentimes access to jobs is constrained for refugees, even if they have the credentials. Third block of questions is how to keep the issue of the education of refugees on the global agenda, particularly at this time when COVID-19 has created a whole set of new priorities. The fourth block of questions is, what kind of institutional arrangements can help ensure that the response to support the education needs of refugees are effective and of quality? And the last block of questions is the legal framework adequate and sufficient to protect all vulnerable migrants? I think it goes back to the question of definition we have addressed. So probably more questions than you can address in the time that you have, but why don't I turn it over to you and do the best you can?
Thank you very much. I'll try. These are big ones. On accountability, well, look, first of all, as time goes by, I think technology and other tools are allowing us increasingly to gather the right evidence to design our programs. And on the basis of that, we can become more seriously accountable. I remember times when, you know, a lot was based on impressions and on reports that people did manually going to visit. There was no other way. Now there's a lot more, there's more sophisticated tools. We have results-based management. We have complex managerial instruments that some of which we're still developing, that we're using, and that we're using also to report back. Remember, you know, UNHCR is a public organization, is an organization that belongs to states. So we're accountable to those states. They're like my shareholders. I don't know how to call them. I'm like you know, the head of the executive head that has to report back to my board, and my board are states. So there is quite a lot of accountability in that, and states are becoming quite scrutinizing, and rightly so. This is public money. This is money voted by parliaments and which belong to citizens, taxpayers, and in this increased ability to scrutinize also what states do, this is part of it. And plus it is foreign assistance. Foreign assistance is more scrutinized than domestic assistance because people say, well, you know, before you go and spend money in a faraway country, you have to meet our needs. So they agree that rich countries in particular can spend money abroad, but they will ask that that money is spent well. Is all of this perfect? No. Are bad things happening? Of course, yes. We're trying to stop them. We're trying to improve them. But I think that we have better accountability tools now that we had before. And accountability, mind you, not just to donors that give us money, but to countries that host refugees and to refugees themselves. It is to them perhaps that we have the greatest accountability. So we're trying to develop also ways to, in a way, report back to the refugees what we're doing for them. Communication today allows a lot of that, although it is very difficult. On relevant education, I already spoke. But one thing that I haven't mentioned, I'll take this opportunity, is to say, I spoke a lot about inclusion in national services, which is really the master direction that we have embarked on in terms of promoting education for refugees. The problem is that in many of the countries where we are promoting inclusion in national systems, quality is poor. But it is poor also for nationals going to those schools. So I think what I always say is that, well, let's use the profile, the visibility that the necessity to include refugees gives to the education system of a particular country, Uganda, for example, in order to help Uganda improve the quality of its system overall. So this becomes an investment, not just in the refugees, but also, especially if they go away later, in the system that is left behind for that particular country. It's an incentive for those countries to include refugees if we help them develop the quality of their education system. How can we keep this on the global scene? Well, you're helping me do it. So thank you for that. And we need many more initiatives like this. We have now some powerful education networks. One is yours, the Refugee and Migration Education Network, but there's many others, education in emergencies in particular attracts resources and advocacy. There are national initiatives all over the world. So I think it's growing. The whole concept is, humanitarian assistance is often linked to food, medicine, shelter, water. Education is not in the first list. Let's put it always in the first list as a primary need for children in particular who are on the move. And I think that will help evolve our thinking. Institutional arrangements, I think I spoke about that, and so did I about the legal framework, so I won't repeat. So I'll stop to the points that I have mentioned. Thanks, Professor Reimers.
Thank you very much. In a moment, I'm going to invite you to give us a last hopeful message. But let me give you some, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tony Cernera to make closing remarks. But let me set the context for these. You probably have read the last encyclical of His Holiness, Fratelli Tutti, an invitation to love all of our fellow humans, regardless of where they are. I think that poses a special challenge for all of us because it's very difficult to love someone you do not know. And one of the paradoxes of our time is that even though we have technologies that allow us to be in conversation across various continents, we live more segregated than ever. These technologies and the way in which residential segregation has evolved has brought us further apart rather than together. And we see that within the United States, we see that within every society that you can imagine and across the world. We know that when people come together, they develop very different views of the other. It's old research from Professor Alport here, contact theory. In fact, a recent graduate of our sociology department did a very interesting study looking at the effect of putting as roommates in the first year of college students from different social classes. And when students had that experience, they developed very much greater interest in structural inequality than when they were put with people of the same classes, regardless of whether they were lower or higher classes. So obviously, getting to know the other is a little helpful to being able to love the other. But refugees, for many people, are invisible. They really don't live in the same communities in which the people who have to vote, who have to get their leaders to support international organizations. So what ideas do you have for how do we make it possible to love your brother in a context in which they are invisible?
These are very beautiful words, Professor Reimers. They could be actually the end of the conference itself, what you just said about knowledge and love. I don't know, there is an additional difficulty to what you said. It's not just invisibility, it's also hostility that has grown from, may I say, very vicious and cheap politicization of the issue of refugees and migrants. We've seen it in the countries you're in. We've seen it in my country. We've seen it all over Europe. We've seen it especially in rich countries, sadly. And so we have to overcome an additional obstacle there, which is not only that these people on the move, be they refugees or migrants often, are invisible and marginalized. They're also an object of hostility and stigmatization. And I don't know, this is unfortunately what the seeds that have been planted around this issue are very strong. And I'm afraid they're generating plants that are very poisonous and that we need to address. We need to address this very, very carefully. I often say to young people, going to your points, when I speak in schools or in university, and they ask me, what can I do? And I always say, get to know one person in your community who is a refugee or a migrant. Get to simply know this person. If you're a young man, or a young woman, go and play, go and study together. By now, in almost every country in a school, you will have somebody who is the son or a daughter of a refugee or a migrant. Do that, because that knowledge is the most invaluable way to advocate for not only this particular person, but for all those like her or like him. And I would say, Professor, that to conclude, and also to use this as my concluding thought, you know, the encyclical that you mentioned, you know, Fratelli Tutti, is so amazing. And a very central thought to it, but in general to Pope Francis' teaching, is it's not only about welfare, it's not only about health and material issues that this issue of migration is about, it's also about dignity. It's so much about dignity. You know, what I feel when I talk to people that are on the move and have lost everything, what they suffer most is, of course, hunger, of course, disease, but it's also the loss of dignity. And knowing them can help them give back some of that dignity, recognizing them as people. But education is powerful for that. Besides every other consideration that we have made, for a kid to go to school when you're 8 and 9 and go to school with other kids is a phenomenal instrument of reacquiring a dignity that even without realizing it, but because they're so young, they have lost in flight, together with everything else that they have left behind. That's why education is also important as an instrument of dignity, as an instrument of knowledge, and of us knowing people who come and seek refuge in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for sharing these thoughts this morning, and for your work and your testimony, and for your courage to do the right thing, even and especially when it is difficult. Let me turn it over to President Tony Cernera for the final benediction. Since we are in the Gregorian University, this is appropriate.
Well, our last 5 minutes of conversation today brought us to the foundational piece, right? The dignity and worth of every human being. And as educators, whether in university settings or in direct contact with refugees in camps or in other settings, that is the foundational truth, that every human being has dignity and worth. And for those of us who come out of a religious tradition, because they're made in the image and likeness of God. So our work is rooted in a profound truth, and one that needs to be reaffirmed in all of our work every day. The Refugee and Migrant Education Network is a young effort to bring together people concerned and interested in educating refugees and migrants. The Gregorian University has been a key cooperator in that effort from the very beginning. Commissioner Grandi, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us today to help focus our work as we go forward. Professor Reimers, your generosity in diving right in when we asked you to help to moderate today, and for your wisdom and insight, thank you. The network has 85 member organizations and universities at this point. We want to invite you to consider, all of you consider keeping in touch with us, collaborating with us as we go forward. The conversation today is the beginning of a series that will stretch out over the rest of this calendar year. The next gathering is on April 13th, and the topic for that one will be innovation in refugee education. We'll be obviously in contact with you on that. Thank you all very, very much for coming, and may our work continue to inspire us to do more. The fulfillment of today's conference will be a renewed commitment on the part of each of us to do something more in reaching out to make education possible. Thank you all very much. Good afternoon and good evening. Bye-bye. Alex, I'm so happy you were part of this. Thank you for joining us today. Hi. Yeah, I think it went really well.
Tony, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you very, very much. Great, great job. And we'll talk later today or tomorrow.
Great.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.